engagement around issues of wealth, poverty, and community organizing have been shaped in light of your faith?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor. Grew up in a little town in Arizona, northern Arizona, Winslow, Arizona, like in the Eagle song. And faith for us was kind of like just the air we breathed. It was we were in church every day. I was the guy folding the bulletins. And but we also didn't have any money. Money was really tight growing up, and we experienced some of the indignities of poverty. The bank took our home after a while when I was in college. And I think that, you know, part of me experienced that moment like a lot of folks do. You blame your parents, you look at individual steps they could have made or should have made. But I think part of me was like asking a bigger question about why is this how a country handles it when a family falls on hard times. Um, went to college, was one of those kids getting his mind blown in classes. And when just trying to figure out the nature of the country. And so when I wasn't working, I was spending a lot of time with homeless people around my university, just talking with them, not serving them or anything, just trying to hear them out. Um, and went to grad school still very angry, honestly, and confused about why there's so much poverty in America. And I think that my faith informed that in a way, in two ways, I think. One is I feel that, our responsibility to the poor is just part of what it means to be a Christian. There's just clear um, uh, marching orders for us, in the scriptures, about hating poverty and hating injustice. And I think part of it too is about like often when the scriptures are talking about inequality, they're talking about an injustice, right? They're not talking about it's an unfortunate, or a disadvantaged. They're like, well, this group is getting over on this other group. And I think that I've kind of carried forward, I think, that scriptural perspective into my own work, where when we're thinking about poverty, we can't just think about folks that are suffering under its heel. We also have to think about how many of us are connected to that problem and the solution.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I didn't have any faith till I was 50, so
Mm.
my career was pretty well underway. I grew up in a Jewish home, Lower East Side of Manhattan, but I went to a church school and a church camp. I sang in the choir, and because it was New York City, the choir was about 30% Jewish, so we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. We'd sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus to square with our religion. So the volume in the church would drop, and then would come back up when the Jews kicked in. And I think from Judaism, there's a concept of co-creation. The concept, the mood in Judaism is a little different than Christianity. Like a Jew would never say, "I'm going to take my hands off the wheel and let God drive," which is sometimes you hear in evangelical circles. So that just concept does not make sense. That God created the world and we are co-creators with Him. So there's a lot of agency and a lot of activity, and with that, a need to pursue justice. And so I think that was beat into me, and also just the immigrant ethos of my grandfather. I came to faith in 2013. Uh, and my joke is that becoming a Christian in 2013 was like investing in the stock market in 1929. Wasn't the best timing. And so I do think, as Matt said, it did, the instructions are right there that the core of the faith is to deal with the help serve the marginalized. And I think the concept made in the image of God became a central concept just for the way I see the world. And so I think my coming to faith was part of a process of deeper humanization and spiritualization from a guy who grew up in a very intellectual home with my parents were academics. And we thought pretty much the world's knowledge is contained and transmitted by books and lectures. I think I hopefully have become a little more emotionally aware and spiritually aware human being over the course of my life. But as I've become slightly more human, American society has become slightly more dehumanized. And so the rise of mental health problems, the rise of callousness, really, is like the growing scandal of our time, which hopefully we all three of us do something about.
Hey, Scott here. If you're enjoying this video, you can like and subscribe to Theology Lab's channel below, and you'll see our latest releases and what's happening at Theology Lab right now. Matt, let me go to you now. Your recent book, Poverty by America, addresses problems of poverty. I think it'd be helpful for listeners to just to get a sense of how do you name what the problem of poverty is and what solutions might look like.
All right, that's a big question. So I mean, so name one easy way to name it is just by the numbers, and about 38 million Americans are poor by official government standards. So 38 million Americans, that's like the population of Australia, just a huge number of people in the country. One in three of us are living in homes making $55,000 or less. So that's a lot of those folks aren't officially poor, but what else do you call it? Trying to raise two kids in Miami or Chicago on $50,000 or less. And so I think there's just a lot of poverty in America. Our child poverty rate is double what it is in Canada or Germany or South Korea. It's interesting, you go to Europe and they have a phrase, American style deprivation. So I think that just to set the table a little bit, we have to just confront that the country just has a serious poverty problem for an advanced democracy this wealthy. But poverty isn't just like income. Like the poet Layla Long Soldier once said, that's just the oil on the surface of the water, right? Like poverty is just all these problems compiled, like one emergency after another, debt collection on top of eviction, on top of you can't go to the dentist, your tooth is really hurting you, on top of not giving your kids enough to eat and they know it, on and on it goes. And for a long time, we've focused on the poor themselves, and we've asked like a million questions about their lives. What this book does is try to shift the aperture and says, look, if you want to know what it's like to live in poverty in America, you got to go and have those kind of conversations with folks that are enduring it. But if you want to know the fundamental causes of poverty, that's probably not where the answer is. And so there's this line I ran across by the novelist Tommy Orange, and he writes, these kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think the problem is that they're jumping. And so when I read that, I was like, oh man, that's like the American poverty debate. And so, this is a book that's not about the jumpers. This is a book that's about the fire. It's about how we continue to exploit the poor in the housing market, in the financial markets, in the labor market. It's about how many of us benefit from that exploitation in ways that we often aren't recognizing. It's about this imbalanced welfare state the United States has, where, especially if you count tax breaks, we're really giving the most, the government is, to families that need it the least. And then we make up this story, about us not being able to afford to do more as a country, even when, we certainly could make deeper impacts in poverty if we just spent a little less guarding fortunes. And then it makes a third argument about segregation, about how we continue to be segregationists in our communities. Democrats are, Republicans are. We build walls around our neighborhoods. We hoard opportunities behind those walls. And there's a side effect, right? There's pockets of concentrated wealth, but the side effect is pockets of concentrated poverty. So that's the diagnosis, and the solution is to address those three things, to take on exploitation by expanding people's choice, by building power, in poor communities, to rebalance that safety net, through things like fair tax implementation that allows us to make deeper investments in any poverty. And finally, to tear down those walls, to finally be the generation that embraces broad prosperity and open communities. So there you go. That's the nutshell.
There is the whole book and just a little glimpse. I wonder if we might be able to make some connections here. David, in 2018, you started a group. You describe it as a social fabric project called Weave. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about what Weave's about, and if you see any connections here to some of the things that Matt's talking about that are in Matt's book. And I'll also just highlight, the article you wrote in The Atlantic recently, which speaks to some economic gaps between the wealthy and the poor that are, equivalent or greater, to some of the racial gaps at the end of Jim Crow. Anything can you give us a sense of what Weave's about? Any connections you see with Matt's work?
Yeah, some connections. First, on the Atlantic piece, Matt mentioned the word segregation. I that piece is about segregation along academic lines and the fact that a kid who grows up in a family in the top 1% is 77 times more likely to go to an Ivy League school than a kid who grows up in a family making 40 or $50,000 a year. So those chasms are caused by the way we've structured our educational system and the way we identify talent, and we do it in a way that the rich people can rig by investing in their kids. So that's one piece. The weave thing, it overlaps, but it's not one to one. And so if we're talking about poverty, the systems that Matt talked about are important. Money is important. The child tax credit really did work, and getting rid of it was a terrible thing, or at least reducing it. But Weave's little focus is on community. The fancy word is social capital. And where it overlaps is what we do is we figured social distrust is a chief problem in America. 2 generations ago, if you asked Americans, do you trust your neighbors? 60% said, yeah, I trust my neighbors. Now it's down to 30% and 19% of millennial. And without social trust, it's really hard to do community action. It's hard to do politics. People don't trust experts. They don't take vaccines. So how do you build social trust? Well, social trust is built on the local level by people who are trustworthy in the course of their relationships. And so we take people who work in the neighborhood where they live, and they build community. And germane to this, I'll give you just three very quick examples. There's an organization called Thread in Baltimore, run by a woman named Sarah Heminger, and they surround thousands of underperforming kids in the Baltimore City schools with four volunteers who basically serve as extended family, and then eight others serve as grandparents, 12 others who serve as collaborators. So they're building this intense social structure around these kids. And they basically work as extended family, like drive you to school, get you lunch, whatever. You need a new phone. And so it's that structure of relationships that they do. A second example, in Britain, I met a woman named Hilary Cottam, and she works on people in the British welfare state. There, she describes a one single family that had 74 contacts with different people in different agencies, and it was costing the government £350,000 a year, and they were never getting anybody out of poverty. And so what she does, she puts the people who are the recipient in charge and says, you pick a team out of all those 74 people who are allegedly helping you, pick a team of 8, and that team will work together under your direction for how you get out of poverty. And so again, it's a social network they're creating. Final example I'll give is a guy named Paul Bourne in Canada, and his belief was that poverty is different in every town. And so for any town to help and to lift those out of poverty, they need to get all the relevant players in the town together, 150 people, and make sure in every room at least 40% of them are the people in poverty. And so they have these team networks, town by town, and they spend a year studying, and they spend a couple of years devising a strategy. Then government money comes in, so there's money involved, but it's really about the building the team of how we're going to do this. And so in each of those little three examples, what we've does is we focus on those who are building what networks of relationships and enhance and embedding people in trustworthy networks.
think I think if you look at a lot of churches, they're going to say, hey, there's specific ways that we approach poverty. We're going to look at the structural issues, or we're going to look at forming people at an individual level. I think both of you are kind of characterized in different ways and where you fall politically, socially. But I wonder what you might say, because both of you, like, David, you've spoke to issues at a structural governmental level. Matthew, when I read your book, it is clearly you are speaking to, in some ways, a lot of ways, but to individuals with wealth and saying, hey, we are part of the issue. So I wonder if if you had a word to communities that maybe strongly lean one way or the other, that either leave structural questions out of the picture or our responsibility as individuals, what you might say to communities like that.
Well, for me, I think both arguments about individual level behaviors leading to poverty And arguments about structural conditions leading to poverty are more similar in one respect than we often think, which is they're pretty absolving. They kind of get us off the hook. The issue either is, someone who's making a mistake, in life, or the issue is history or structure, and like good luck explaining what structure is, to your friend in Thanksgiving. It's like, what does that even mean? And so I think that it's kind of this strange story that we've told ourselves that like there's this a ton of people that aren't able to meet their basic needs. And it's kind of like doesn't involve us. We're not part of that story. So, Tolstoy raised this at the end of his career. He moves to Moscow. He sees all this poverty in Moscow that just hits him really hard. And he's like, what is the cause of this? And he does all these fascinating things. He joins the census so he can talk to people. He adopts a kid. The kid runs away. And then finally, he kind of just faces the fact that it's on me. I'm part of this. I'm embroiled in this. And we could talk about this specifically. Like, for example, we often kind of look at the housing crisis and we say, gosh, this is a really unfortunate crisis. And the landlords or the corporate landlords are really benefiting from this. And that's a really important conversation. But another important conversation is to be like, look, aren't homeowners benefiting from this sometimes? Don't we collectively act to make housing really scarce and expensive because that props up our property values? Or, isn't it true that, when my retirement count goes up and up and up like magic, that sometimes that comes at a human cost, borne by the working poor. I'm connected to their lives in ways. And so I think that for me, kind of, walking away or kind of splitting the difference between those two, poles that are often associated with a conservative take or liberal stake, and often asking, look, can we kind of face the fact that some lives are made small so that others may grow? And face the fact that a lot of us don't want to have that, don't like that arrangement. I think that gets us to a more productive and honest place than often the debate currently is set.
Yeah, just on the structural piece, the piece I spent the last several months working on the diploma divide. I mean, it's an example of where some of us, like, we invest in those of us who have means, invest in our kids. There's a guy at Yale named Daniel Markovits who calculates that the average college-educated family invests over the course of the child the equivalent of about $10 million per kid.
Hmm.
Good private school tuition, oboe practice, hockey practice, trips to museums, trips to Europe. And that's just a massive investment. And so it should be no surprise that when you go to an elite school, that you'll have often more students from the top 1% of earners than the bottom 60%. And we have this weird system where we take the people who are privileged and we invest more massively in them. So if you go to an Ivy League school, the amount of money that school is spending on you is somewhere in the ranks of $350,000 a year. And that's for the rich kids. And then if you don't go to that kind of school and you go to a community college, well, we're spending about $11,000 on you. So it's this weird system where we spend more on the privilege than on everybody else. And so we're all implicit in this system. And so how do you think about how can we change that? And that just takes fundamental systemic change. The part I focus on and weave is a little less that and more at the local level. And so I've learned through Weave, and I don't know if Matt will agree with me, but that the neighborhood is the unit of change. That, as a friend of mine says, you can't only clean the part of the swimming pool you're swimming in. You got to clean the pool. And so when we don't want to have systems, in my view, that pluck certain talented kids out of neighborhoods and send them off places and they don't come back and the neighborhood is left. And so we want to clean the whole neighborhood. And so, for example, just to say Raj Chetty again, he did a study on two neighborhoods in LA, Compton and Watts. And Compton had way higher social mobility than Watts. Compton had way lower incarceration rates than Watts, even though these two neighborhoods are demographically very similar and maybe 3 miles apart from each other. So what's the deal? And so I spent weeks in Compton and Watts, and my conclusion was Compton is an actual city within LA, and Watts is just a neighborhood. So it has way more civic structures, and then there are many more places to go in Compton. So if you're a kid, there's many more nonprofits who are there, so you can go do homework, whatever. Uh, and I met a woman in Watts who runs a little program called Sisters of Watts, who just takes kids who need food. She gives them backpacks full of food to take home, that sort of thing. She's just a mom. Uh, and she says in Watts, the foundations come in for 3 years. They get a grant. The grant runs out, and they leave, and they never talk to us. And so the other thing I've learned in this work is that the neighborhood knows what it needs. And so if you empower the neighborhood knows what it needs. It doesn't always have the resources, but it has the expertise and it has the trusted messengers. And so I think a little about systems, but mostly I'm thinking about the local neighborhood system to see if it's the kind of place where people are able to support one another. And I have to say, and this would be interesting, I was a flaming socialist in college and in high school. You can go on YouTube, and if you Google your YouTube David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you'll see me as a socialist debating with Milton Friedman on TV and getting destroyed, by the way. And this one of the things that shifted me right. I became a police reporter after college, and I'm covering places like the Robert Taylor homes and Cabrini Green, which are projects in Chicago. And well-meaning social planners looked at these old, what had been wooden, rickety neighborhoods, and they say, let's help these people. Let's tear down those wooden, rickety neighborhoods, and let's put up high rises. And when they tore down the rickety neighborhoods, they never asked the people in the neighborhoods, as usual. But they tore out the systems of support that were in those neighborhoods. And by the time I got there as a reporter, Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor homes were horrible places, run by gangs, etc. And fortunately now they've been torn down. But that's the importance of having, aside from the big systemic things, having mutual support systems at the local level.
Oh, so I can't just leave that hanging. The neighborhood is the unit of change. Matt, just want to give you an opportunity to comment on that if you want.
I mean, there's a lot of data to back that up. And I think that, one way I'm thinking about this is, when we have this conversation, we're often focused on material poverty, but there's also the spiritual poverty that's gripping the country, especially in affluent communities. And so one of the things that I often ask my audiences is like, how's your kind of scared affluence working out for you? And I think there's a lot of folks that are very secure and comfortable in their money and feel completely lonely and isolated and disconnected from other folks. And in that fear of like really trying to protect your property values, making sure like only kids that, have professional parents can go to this public school, those kind of things. We create these systems, these downstream systems for other neighborhoods that are really crunched. So the conversation about gentrification kind of drives me a little nuts because, you have this conversation that's basically like pitting folks that really could use housing against folks that are just barely hanging on to their housing. And should we gentrify? Should we not? Should we build? Should we not? And the only reason we're having that conversation like that is because these neighborhoods over here, these wealthy, affluent neighborhoods have been so successful at keeping out any kind of affordable housing. So, when I think of Washington, D.C., for example, I don't think of gentrification just being a place that's affecting the U Street corridor. I'm also thinking about Georgetown, about how those homeowners have been so good at keeping folks out. So I think this is a way to think about neighborhoods as in this connected system and how like opening up those neighborhoods. Look, it's not going to be all like sunshine and butterflies. It's going to be really a really hard thing to do, I think, and awkward, and it's going to be scary for a lot of folks. But I think opening up those neighborhoods not only asks us to aspire to higher values, it also gives an opportunity for something that David's talking about to form that deeper kind of social fabric in communities.
Matt, you've just mentioned spiritual poverty, then moved into material poverty. There is spiritual poverty, but it is also very possible for faith communities where there's a lot of wealth to talk about spiritual poverty. I'm sure it's very well intentioned, but in a way that then distracts from having to engage with material poverty. So the question I want to pose to both of you is, how do you see the connection between spiritual poverty and material poverty? How do you want people who are engaging faith communities, who are shaping faith communities, want to say, like, to see that spiritual poverty and material poverty are deeply connected. Can you make a case for that, a point about that?
The first thing that comes to mind, I write these books on moral formation and things like that. And I often get the question, um, isn't that to think about character and spiritual formation, isn't that a luxury that people who are well off have? People who are not as financially well off, they're hustling through, they're just trying to survive, so they can't think about those things. And my only answer is that I've been in very poor parts of the world where the churches, mosques, and synagogues are full. And that people, there's this great book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And he said, what did we care about in the camps? What did we talk about? And so they're in Nazi concentration camps and they're deprived of everything. And he said the two things we talked about were food and religion. And it's interesting to me that the sex drive totally went away. There was no sex in Auschwitz. But the need for spirituality loomed. And so to me, that spiritual urge is a foundational drive and not a luxury good. And it's universal. And when I think of spiritual poverty, I confess I see it as independent often of financial poverty. If you look at all the statistics I spend a lot of time thinking about, 54% of Americans say no one knows them well. The number of Americans who say they have no close personal friends is up by fourfold since 2000. 36% of Americans say they're persistently hopeless and despondent. The number of people without a romantic relationship is up by a third. The number of people who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. So we've just become a sadder society and a meaner society. Because when you feel unseen and disrespected, you regard it as a threat, which it is, and an indignity, which it is, and you lash out. And I won't bore you with all the meanness statistics, but the one that bothers me is that a generation ago, two-thirds of Americans gave to charity, and now fewer than half of all Americans give to charity. So there's been a pulling in, and that is not related to income, in my view. That the spiritual hungry people are up and down the income scale. And one of the things I'll point out to, because I taught at Yale and I teach at Chicago, these elite places, my students are morally inarticulate. They're good people, they're wonderful people, but nobody has given them the language to talk about spiritual formation. So words like redemption, grace, sin. And if you don't have those words, it's kind of hard. And the final point I'd make is that one of the things we've done in the society has privatized morality. So the idea of the faiths are based on the idea there is a universal moral order. George Marsden, a great historian, wrote about Martin Luther King that what gave his rhetoric such force was the sense that good and evil are written into the fabric of the universe. That segregation is not just wrong according to some taste, segregation is wrong eternally, and slavery is wrong eternally. And one of the things we've done is we said, come up with your own values. And so if you leave morality and the moral order that holds us up to each individual, you're sort of tearing apart the fabric and you're leaving people spiritually naked and alone. And that, to me, is part of the existential anxiety that pervades society. And as Hannah Arendt said, existential anxiety always produces fanaticism, which is sort of where we are.
Just stay back a little bit there. You said, this kind of spiritual drive being independent of material reality, but I also hear you saying that it is like the bedrock of a flourishing person and community, having a spiritual compass, a spiritual sense. Matthew, I'm curious at how you might answer this question. You are suggesting policy changes, and you've been lumped in with kind of like a ringleader for the new social gospel movement, right? So this is the intersection of kind of where a call to a lived faith and policy come together. I'm curious at how you might see a connection between our spiritual lives and material lives.
I think one place I go with this question is the abolitionists, And so if you think of Douglas or Sumner and what was their argument against slavery? Their argument was it was inhumane, it was horrendous, that it was evil. But there was another argument. And the argument was when you profit from someone else's pain, it's spiritually corrupting to you. And if you're drinking that sugar, if you're wearing that cotton cloth, if you were invested in, the slave trade market, the bond market based on human trafficking, it does something to you. It takes a piece of you away. And I think that we can feel that today in America when those of us who have means kind of start realizing or peeling back how sometimes we're winning because someone else is losing. Um, we can feel it. And I think we've been in situations where you go to that restaurant and you're eating, you're getting served, but no, everyone looks exhausted and unhappy, and you just feel icky about it. Or you get on a public bus, or you get on the T in Boston, and you just see folks just nodding off, and you kind of you don't you feel your embroilment, embeddedness in those relationships. And I think that that speaks a lot to the connection between spiritual poverty and material poverty. Often, when we ignore that, like what David said, when we kind of, have this kind of like scared affluence, that can have a spiritual cost and it can have a material cost for those of us who are affluent. So Galbraith talked about this idea of private opulence and public squalor. And when you go to, cities like Lagos, like in the developing world, you see these giant mansions surrounded by a lot of poverty and private security firms. And, when I go to places like that, they remind me a lot of the trajectory America's on, more so than I get reminded when I go to Germany or England, for example. And so I think understanding that connection is important. I guess one more beat on this question, which is like I've I've lived in some really poor neighborhoods, and I've lived in affluent neighborhoods. Like David, I teach at fancy places. I teach at Princeton right now, and I don't want to romanticize poor neighborhoods, but like there's a neighborliness I think that's alive in low-income working class neighborhoods that's really hard to find, that I haven't found outside of those neighborhoods too. So there is something that, affluent Americans that are not in deep relationships with those below the lines are missing spiritually because, they've got that two-car garage and, vaulted ceilings, but that other thing is missing.
I'm going to add one anecdote here. Matt, you don't know this yet, but I want to make a connection with your book. There is a point in your book, it's probably around page 180, where you talk about a story of a snowstorm coming when you're in Milwaukee, and everybody comes out and takes care of one another in this community where there's a lot of poverty. And then you talk about living in Boston, and people come out and they only shovel to the end of their sidewalks. And there's a story
Yeah.
about your wife shoveling and a
Yeah.
20-year-old watching from the window who doesn't help, and she's pregnant at the time,
Yeah.
and who doesn't help at all. And the difference between those, so not romanticizing it, but also seeing this community that realizes, hey, we live life together, and we come out and we support one another.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember living in Milwaukee and working on my book Evicted, and I was spending time with a family I call the Hinkstons in that book, and they're really hard up. They were living in a home just full of cockroaches. The landlord stopped fixing the plumbing, so the sewage was backed up into the bathroom. They called their home the rat house. It was a tough place. And I remember going over to visit them in February, and they said, Matt, our heat is shut off. Can you go look in the basement to see if you can do anything? And I don't know the first thing about heating systems, but I'm like a man, so I'm like, oh yeah, I'll check it out. So I fumble around in the basement. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm flipping on light switches. So I come up and it was just a ruse. They had bought me a birthday cake. My birthday's in February, and it was a little surprise. But here's the thing. Their heat was off. It was legit off in February in Milwaukee. And, but there was that moment of seeing in generosity. And I've got so many stories like that. And I know David has a ton of stories like that. And I think that it reminds you how gracefully people enduring deep hardship refuse to be defined by that hardship. But it also reminds you of what you're missing when you're living in a neighborhood like East Arlington, Massachusetts, when you don't feel like you can even ask your neighbor for a cup of sugar.
Well, here's the rub of why this story hit me so hard is you mentioned it's in East Arlington, and at some point someone told me that there was a Harvard professor who lived down the street. I did a quick Google search and realized I think that the street you talked about, where the neighbors did not help one another, I've lived on that street for the last 12 years.
Well, I hope you're shoveling all the way down the block, Scott.
I've changed. I'm a changed human being, and I am. David, I want to go to one more question I want to put to you here, and then I'll put a question to you both. David, I know that you intentionally host gatherings that cross social boundaries. And I wonder if you have any kind of stories. You've shared some stories with us so far, but other stories about how these gatherings of community have changed ways that you think about poverty, wealth, social organizing, anything along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I got divorced in 2013 and went through a hard time, as one does. And my kids were going off to college, and I was living in this crappy little apartment. And I did what any male idiot would do, was I tried to work my way through it. So I just did workaholism, and so it symbolized for me in the kitchen where I wasn't having anybody over to my house. So where there should have been silverware in the drawer, I had post-it notes, and where there should have been plates, I had stationery. And so that symbolized to me a low period in my life, though I did a lot of running and I was in the best shape of my life. But so I got invited over to a house of a couple named Kathy and David in DC. And they had a kid in the DC public schools named Santi. And Santi had a friend named James. And James's mom had some health and drug and other issues. And so there wasn't always a place for James to sleep or eat. And so they said, well, James can stay with us. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. By the time I go to their house on a Thursday night for dinner, I there are 40 kids around the dining table and 15 mattresses in the basement. And so I walk in there, um, and I reach out to shake a kid's hand, and he says, "We're not allowed to shake hands here. We just hug here." And I'm like, not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I hugged, and I went back to that dinner table every Thursday night for the next 7 years until COVID. And we vacationed together. We did holidays together. We had some of the kids, we call them kids, but they were really 18, 19, live with us for a while. And what was beautiful for me in a selfish sense is that they demanded emotional openness, and they were going to beam their love at you, and we had to beam back. That was, and so it was really a emotional renaissance for me because of just the way that community was. Now, the interesting thing I think about this still, some of them really had tough backgrounds. And I remember our first Christmas we celebrated together. I remember one kid, a beautiful photographer, um, he didn't know how to unwrap a Christmas present. He never had that experience. And so there would always be those moments where I was startled. But they all wanted to become artists. And one of the challenges that I thought through, my wife and I, when we got married later, um, do we encourage them to pursue the arts as their career? Is that realistic for 40, 20-year-olds? And we ended up doing it because the world has been tough enough on them. They just need encouragement. And we just want to be on your side. And frankly, the arts is what kept them off out of jail because it was the organizing principle of their life. But I question whether that was the right thing to do. Now they're in their mid to late 20s. And so for some, it's worked out. For some, it hasn't. Frankly, it's been a lot easier on the women than the men, the intervening years. But it's just dealing with these daily dilemmas. That community really did renovate my heart. But I still think about the daily dilemmas and how to accompany people through those kind of lives.
I appreciate you sharing a story that would talks about how you were changed in that, but also the remaining kind of ambiguities that are still up in the air around that. Last final question here for both of you. Christians are moved to act in the world based on a vision of what they believe matters to God, right? Of what God is doing in the world. Are there ways that you see our faith imagination, right? Especially having hope for a future. Do you think that can inspire us to address problems of poverty, social relationships that are essential for our communities?
So for me, I think a lot of Christians, a lot of people of faith in general, a lot of Americans, um, are fed up with all this poverty and inequality, but don't really know what to do. They vote a certain way or they express it a certain way, but what does that mean for us on a day-to-day level? But I think there's a lot of ways that we can plug in and kind of commit ourselves to like poverty abolitionism, kind of being a person that's trying to divest day in and day out from the system so we can flex our influence where we are. If we're on our church board, for example, we could start pushing the church to think more and more about addressing inequality. I would love the faith community, for example, to get to take on the predatory lending um, industry and say, look, we've got some capital here. We can lend it. Let's rely on social trust. Let's rely on the relationships we have in this neighborhood. And there's no reason if folks, need $200 to pay their light bill that they have to end up paying $700 for that, in 5, 6 months. And so that's, flex your influence where you have. Think about voting with your wallet. Holidays are coming up. You can buy more union-made goods, goods that are made by corporations or businesses that are really doing right by their workers. You go to London and you walk down the streets, the stores have this sticker. It's like this store pays a living wage. And when I saw that, I was like, gosh, we've got a lot of stickers, but we don't have that one. And thinking about how to just take a beat, and try to think about investing differently, buying things differently, talking about our taxes differently you know? And the next time tax season rolls around, we don't have to take all the deductions that we're afforded. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should, if we have the mortgage interest deduction, for example, which is a really, really impossible deduction, I think, to justify. If we get that, maybe we should donate that to our local eviction defense and write our congressperson saying, I don't want this thing. Take it away from me. Um, let's go to zoning board meetings, and stand up and be like, I refuse to underwrite segregation in my community. I want to give those kids opportunities my kids get by living here. And then there's just a ton of awesome anti-poverty organizations all around the country putting in work that are just having a ball too doing it. And I think that a lot of them are faith-based, a lot of them aren't. But getting plugged into that movement, I think is a way to live out your faith in a really exciting, joyful way.
Yeah, and I would just say concretely on the big systemic level, look at where we are right now. We're talking a few weeks after the election. Um, the child tax credit really is a thing that could be re-expanded. There really are Democrats are obviously supportive, but there are some Republicans who have long been supportive. And I don't know if this Congress can do anything on a bipartisan basis, but there's the nub of hope on that issue. And so that's a concrete issue right in front of us. The second concrete issue right in front of us is mass deportation. In my view, Donald Trump has a worldview about immigration, but he's also vain and he likes to remain popular. And my hope is that a lot of people voted for Donald Trump because they want the economy of 2019 back. They didn't vote for taking families who've been living here for decades and ripping them out and sending them somewhere they've probably not that familiar with anymore. And so if the country can rise up to impel Donald Trump by when he sees his popularity decline, then that's a concrete thing that is right in front of us. So those are the concrete things. The second thing I would just say, and I'll go back to my Weave experience, we give out what these things called Weaver Awards, where we give money to people who are hyper local, living in the neighborhood they serve, and it doesn't take much. Some of our awards are $8,000 so they can have health insurance for the year, or some of them is 12,000 or 15,000, and it makes a huge difference to them. And the second thing we offer them, which is each other, because a lot of people who are doing the work on the local level, they live lives of service, but nobody's serving them. And so there's burnout and exhaustion, and they love having the chance to be with each other to provide mutual support. And sometimes we get public recognition. We had the Baltimore Ravens had a Weaver night, and they put the faces of the local community leaders on the big jumbotron there. Um, and just the chance to tell their story. We have a speaking agency, so they can go out and they can get on NPR if they want to go, or South by Southwest, places like that. People love to tell their story, and we all profit from it. And so what strikes me is how approachable at least these little local gestures are. It doesn't take huge billions of dollars. It just takes some time or even little dollops of money. And I don't know if it'll make big systemic change, but I've just seen So many people. There's one final person I'll mention. I ran into a guy in Houston named Pancho Arguelles who takes undocumented workers and gives them wheelchairs who've been paralyzed in construction accidents.
Hmm.
Gives them wheelchairs, diapers, catheters. He ran an organization which still exists, though he's moved on, called the Living Hope Wheelchair Association. And he's just a beautiful human being. And I once said, Pancho, you radiate holiness. And he said, no, I reflect holiness, which is the right Christian answer, by the way. And so there's just so many, it's just so many inspiring little lives, and lives speak to us. I write newspaper columns, but lives speak to us in a way no newspaper column ever could.
Matt and David, I think you've both named a handful of real practical steps that we can take. But also, I want to note that I just appreciate your willingness, your public thought leaders that people look to and read, that you shape their lives, and your openness to speak about how your faith informs, inspires, plays into your work, plays into what it means to be a human. So thank you both for being such great guests. Thanks for being part of Theology Lab.
Thank you.
Pleasure, Scott. Thank you.